welcome to Trails Worth Hiking, the show that brings you some of the most interesting backpacking and trekking routes in the world. I'm your host, Jeremy Pendry. In the first part of the show, we bring you the story and history of a trail. Then we tell you what it's like to hike the trail and how you can do it. On this episode, we go back to the Rockies, but not for a Colorado Rocky Mountain high. This time we go further north and climb spectacular passes and rugged mountains and hike through beautiful meadows and past stunning alpine lakes where we'll have relative solitude hiking and camping in an impressive national park, but not a national park of the United States. On this episode of Trails Worth Hiking, we make our first trip to the Canadian Rockies, where we'll hike the Sawback Trail from Banff to Lake Louise in Banff National Park in Alberta, Canada. Welcome to the show, everyone. Thank you for being here. First, I want to announce that the winner of our Instagram contest, where you had to guess which trail the photo was from, is Clay Ryan. Clay is a former guest on the show. He was on the Wonderland Trail episode. The photo in the Instagram contest was from the Tour de Mont Blanc, and I guess Clay is the right person to win that contest because he hiked that trail twice, so he was very familiar with it, and I'm sure had an advantage over the rest of you on that one. But there will be a future contest upcoming, so keep an eye out for that, where we will feature a different hike. And you can check it out on Instagram and try to guess which hike it is and win an Outdoor Herbivore gift certificate. As a reminder, Outdoor Herbivore makes high-quality vegetarian and vegan backpacking meals, but as I always say, you don't need to be a vegetarian or a vegan to enjoy these meals. They have lots of calories for a hungry hiker. They use very high-quality ingredients. They're delicious meals, and they're packaged in easy-to-use boil-in-a-bag packaging, so you can just pour in hot water, stir, and let them sit, and your dinner is ready. So check out Outdoor Herbivore at outdoorherbivore.com. Outdoor Herbivore is also sponsoring our upcoming Trails Worth Hiking backpacking meetup at Point Reyes National Seashore on March 22nd and 23rd, 2025. We have a really good turnout coming, but there are a few spots left if you want to go. So if you do, shoot me an email at trailsworthhiking@gmail.com very soon, because the trip is coming up in just a couple of weeks. Point Reyes National Seashore is very beautiful, and Wildcat Camp, where we will be camping, is fantastic. Point Reyes is a great place for beginning backpackers because you have a reserved site. There are picnic tables. There's a bathroom, even though it's just a pit toilet, not a running water bathroom. But there is potable water from a faucet as well. But if you can't make the Point Reyes meetup, there is another opportunity to go backpacking with me coming up that I want to tell you about. In June, I will be in Southern California at Big Bear Lake to hike the Highlander event. I'm excited to tell you about this event that goes from June 17th to June 21st, although there are shorter versions of the event, which I'll explain in a moment. So if you're someone who's been on a hut-to-hut or refuge-to-refuge or inn-to-inn or tea house type of trek, but have never done backpacking and are interested to learn, this is the event for you. Though even if you are a backpacker already, this looks to be a really fun event, particularly if you want to try a more social backpacking experience. So let me tell you about what Highlander is. Highlander is fully supported backpacking. All your meals and beverages are provided and included with the fee, even including some snacks, though you may want to bring snacks that you prefer. The meals are customizable to special dietary restrictions. When I enrolled to go to Highlander, I was able to select a vegan diet for my meals. You only carry 1 day of food at a time, and then the next day you get a resupply, so you don't have to carry huge amounts of food no matter how long of a hike you do. As I understand it, the campsites are at established car campgrounds, which have real facilities like bathrooms and running water, including, I believe, showers maybe at some of them, though don't quote me on that. There are also experts who will be there providing talks on various backpacking-related subjects. There's going to be live music, I think, at the end of the hike. There's some workshops. There's even yoga sessions that you can participate in while you're in camp. You get a detailed map. You'll also get GPX tracks to use for your electronic devices to follow the route, and there'll be preparation webinars that you can participate in before the event. They also have first aid and medical staff there in case of emergencies. And for those of you who have never tried backpacking and don't own backpacking gear, you can rent it from them, and they can provide you full gear for the entire trip, and you don't have to worry about going out to buy a bunch of new gear. And this, I think, is the best part. This is really a sort of choose your own adventure trip. And what that means is there are 1, 2, 3, and 5-day versions of the event. I'm going to do the 5-day version. There's actually 2 5-day versions. I'm going to be doing the one called the Hercules event, which is basically just a standard backpacking trip. There's a more intense 5-day version that includes climbing some peaks. But no matter which event you do, you can hike with me. The starts for the events are staggered so that everyone finishes together. So no matter which version of the event you do, you hike with everyone who is already on the trail. So if, for example, you did the 2-day version, I will have already hiked 3 days when you start, and we would join up when you start. The distances are reasonable per day, though challenging. The area around Big Bear Lake is really beautiful. And Trails Worth Hiking listeners get a 20% discount off the registration fee with the discount code Jeremy20. It's Jeremy, all caps, and then 20. So Jeremy20. If you register with that code, it will not only get you a discount, but will also help the show. So if you do register, send me an email and let me know which version of the event you are doing so that we can connect and hike together and have a chance to hang out and camp in the evening as well. I'll put a link in the show notes to the Highlander website, and I hope to see you there. This will be really fun. It's not something I've done before, so I'm going to give it a try and see how it is. Again, the discount code for 20% off is Jeremy20. And finally, before we're jumping into this episode's hike, another event that I want to tell you about is the Spring Wildflower Pilgrimage in Great Smoky Mountains National Park. This year is the 75th anniversary of this event. There are lots of hikes that are scheduled where you can go hiking with an expert and learn a lot about the flora and fauna of the park, not just about wildflowers, but about lots of things. Registration is now open. I recently spoke with Nina Vedito, who is leading 2 separate hikes at the event about this great event. So let's listen to a few minutes from Nina explaining what this event is and why you might be interested to check it out.
The Wildflower Pilgrimage is actually the oldest and largest public educational and outreach event in the U.S. So it's an incredible 4-day event with all kinds of programs led by experts in the field. And, the general public is invited to come and take part and learn all about the wonders of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park.
Despite the name, it's not just about wildflowers. From what I saw on the website, it looks like there are also programs about fungi, ferns, trees, shrubs, medicinal plants, insects, salamanders, snakes, birds, mammals, lots of things.
Oh, yeah. No, I'm glad you mentioned that because it started out as primarily a wildflower event, given the fact that, the Great Smoky Mountains National Park is known as Wildflower National Park and has, the largest concentration of wildflowers. So it sort of started out that way, but in the 75 years that it's been in existence, the programs have expanded exponentially. So there are, yes, you said it. There's pretty much anything that walks, crawls, flies, or in terms of plants, just is there in the park. There's probably a program about it. So there are 190 different programs that are available over the 4-day event. So yeah, there's a lot there.
I looked at the program and I was really surprised at how many events there are. It's just really packed. Can you tell people a little bit about what kinds of activities they could do if they come to this event?
Absolutely. Generally speaking, when you sign up, you'll, choose the different hikes that you'd be interested in, and then you get matched or you get paired with a hike leader, and that leader is going to take you out on a hike and teach you about whatever it is, their expertise is. It might be lichen, it might be bats, that type thing. So yeah, there's a huge range, but you are Generally speaking, most of these programs are trekking programs. So you are hiking along with your instructor. There are half-day events and then whole-day events as well. And then there are some little things here and there, like, obviously like the stargazing events. Those aren't necessarily hikes, but you can pretty much plan on a good half-day trek with any program that you sign up for.
Perfect. When is the event?
The event is April 23rd through the 26th. Tickets go on sale March 1st.
Is there anything else people should know about the event before thinking about whether to sign up?
Well, I would just encourage everybody to definitely check out the website. It's an incredible event. People come from all over the country and even from around the world to take part in this. It is really spectacular, and it's a great opportunity and possibly one of the very few where you can actually get out onto the trails with an expert and just learn all kinds of amazing things. Like last year, I went to a glow-in-the-dark lichen trek, which was incredible. There's so much there to learn, and the park is just such an extraordinary place to explore. So I highly encourage folks to check it out. I really think that there's no way you can be disappointed. It's just a fantastic event.
Thanks again to Nina for telling us about the Spring Wildflower Pilgrimage. All right. Our guest on this episode is Gavin Fitch. Gavin is a hiker from Calgary, Alberta, Canada. He's a board member and past president of the Royal Canadian Geographical Society, which is the Canadian equivalent of National Geographic, as he'll explain. Recently, along with some like-minded friends, he also founded the Canadian Backcountry Preservation Society to protect and maintain trails in Canada, and we'll talk about that with Gavin as well. Gavin hiked the Sawback Trail in Banff in 2018. So I've never been to Banff or to Jasper, the park just north of it, so I was excited to hear about this backpacking trip. I have been to Waterton Lakes National Park in Alberta, which is a little bit south of these parks. Waterton Lakes is the opposite side of the border from Glacier National Park in Montana. And that was a beautiful national park, and I had a great trip there with my family. But we didn't make it to Banff or Jasper further north. So this was a great opportunity for me to hear about Banff. This trail has classic mountain scenery, and it's in a part of the Rockies we haven't covered on the show. It's the third Canadian province we've covered. If you're interested in other really great trails in Canada, you can check out the Bruce Trail in Ontario in episode 40, or the West Coast Trail in British Columbia in episode 19. The Canadian Rockies are the easternmost part of the Canadian Cordillera. That would be the Spanish pronunciation. Do you say that word like that in English? I don't even know. Anyway, these are the western mountains of Canada, and they're part of the eastern section of the Pacific Ring of Fire. So it has been at various times an active volcanic area and is connected to plate tectonics action. To the east of the Canadian Rockies are prairies that make up a good portion of Canada. The Canadian Rockies rose up between 80 to 55 million years ago. One thing that's interesting is that the Canadian Rockies are different in appearance and geology from the American Rockies to the south that we talked about, for example, on the Colorado Trail episode. The Canadian Rockies are layered sedimentary rock, so things like limestone and shale. The American Rockies in the United States are mostly igneous rock like granite. What that means is there's more glaciation and more big U-shaped valleys in the Canadian Rockies because sedimentary rock is softer and water and ice can carve through it more easily. The Canadian Rockies are also cooler and wetter than the Rockies in the United States, and even today have many more glaciers still existing than in the Rockies in the US. There's also a lower tree line because you're at a higher latitude, so the trees disappear at a lower elevation. There are grizzly bears, there are cougars, there's elk, there's bighorn sheep, there's moose. The conifers consist primarily of lodgepole pine and Engelmann spruce. The human history in this area goes way back. There's over 450 archaeological sites in the area, including Clovis Point findings that date back 13,000 years. Historically, the Bow Valley, where Banff is, was a trading center where various indigenous groups would meet and come to trade their goods. Some traveled to these meetings on the Bow River itself. It's called the Bow River because the indigenous peoples there made bows from the Douglas fir trees that grow in the valley. Many different groups of indigenous peoples would live seasonally in the Bow Valley where Banff is. Let me go through a few of the different indigenous groups that have been in this area. There's the Stoney Nakoda. Europeans called them the Stonies because they used heating stones for cooking. The Stonies were a pretty prominent group in this area and were ultimately, though, removed from the mountain areas in 1885 when Banff National Park was created, and their ability to hunt and gather in the area was restricted. So, of course, not always good things coming out of preserving land as wilderness, as a park. At least in this case, there were certainly some negative side effects that impacted the indigenous peoples. The Stoney Nakotas speak a dialect of Dakota Sioux, so they're sort of a northern relative or related somehow to those groups in the northern plains of the U.S. There's also the Kootenai, the Blackfoot, and the Tsuut'ina peoples that have lived in the area. The Tsuut'ina speak an Athabascan language, which is related to languages spoken by peoples who live further north, like in Alaska. There's the Shuswap peoples as well. The Shuswaps speak a Salish language, which is a language from the Pacific Northwest of Canada, so they may have come from a different area before being in this area. The Shuswap are interesting because they built winter homes in the area that were partially underground, that have been called pit houses. There were a number of treaties signed in the 1880s that governed the relationship of these various indigenous groups to Canada. One other really interesting thing that I found in looking into this is the history of the Métis people. And I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. I'm pronouncing it in the French pronunciation, which you'll hear in a minute why I'm doing that. It could be the Métis. I'm not sure how they say it in Alberta, but let's go with Métis. So the Métis are a mix of indigenous and European ancestry, and they're considered a culturally distinct group. And though I realize there may be some controversy around who and what they are, let me give a sketch of it. Essentially, their European ancestry is primarily French, but also Scottish and English at times. Though, like I said, I think originally it was mostly French. And their indigenous ancestry is primarily Cree. And these peoples arose as a result of fur trading by Europeans in the area. So essentially, the first and earliest Europeans in the area intermarried or had relationships that produced children with Cree peoples. Alberta is the only province that recognizes a land base for the Métis. So meaning that they recognize essentially a homeland for the Métis in Alberta. So that's an interesting cultural history as well, where you have not only a history of Europeans and a current presence of Europeans, but also a history of indigenous peoples and a history of a mixed group of indigenous and European peoples. So we've been talking about the Bow Valley and the Banff area. What are we actually talking about? Banff National Park was created in 1885, and it was Canada's first national park. It's west of Calgary. It has lots of glaciers, coniferous forest, and alpine landscapes. The way the park was formed is actually interesting. The Canadian Pacific Railway was building through the Bow Valley, and railway workers discovered a hot springs at what is now called Sulphur Mountain. That created an ownership dispute about who had the rights to control the hot springs, and ultimately the government took over and protected it and formed a reserve around the hot springs. But over time, that protection was expanded to bigger and bigger areas and ultimately resulted in Banff National Park. The Canadian Pacific Railway was being built to bring tourists through the area. Later, the Trans-Canada Highway was built through Banff, which is important for our purposes because the Trans-Canada Highway connects the town of Banff, where the trail starts near, to the town of Lake Louise, where the trail ends. So the Trans-Canada Highway is a pretty convenient and easy way to get from beginning to end and do a shuttle for this hike. Banff National Park is part of a UNESCO World Heritage Site, along with other parks in the Canadian Rockies. In 1984, they were designated as such for their natural beauty and importance to the region and the world. Banff is the most visited national park in Canada. There are 4.5 million visitors a year. The town of Banff itself is a resort town. It's a very popular tourist destination, as I said. It has the hot springs, but also, of course, the mountains around it. And it was named by Scottish founders of the town after Banffshire in Scotland. The town was built for tourism for the railroad, but for a long time was not technically a town. In 1990, though, it was incorporated as a town and became the only town inside a Canadian national park. The town of Lake Louise is at the north end of the hike. That was created in 1884 as an outpost for the Canadian Pacific Railway. Lake Louise is at 5,200 feet in elevation, or about 1,600 meters in elevation, which is the highest altitude town in Canada. The town of Lake Louise is about 2 kilometers from Lake Louise itself, so a little over a mile. The town of Lake Louise is much smaller than the town of Banff. It has less than 1,000 people. But when you think of Lake Louise, you don't think of the little town. The famous photos that many of you will have seen are of the lake itself and Chateau Lake Louise, which is a big hotel right on the edge of the lake. These days, it's part of the Fairmont hotel chain. It's on the eastern shore of the lake, and at the beginning of the 20th century, the hotel was developed by the Canadian Pacific Railway, originally as a way to lure moneyed travelers west on the railway. Until the 1980s, the hotel was only for summer stays, but they winterized it, and now it is a winter ski destination as well. All right, so with that background, let's now listen to my conversation with Gavin Fitch about the Sawback Trail. Gavin Fitch, welcome to the show. Thank you for being here.
Oh, well, thank you.
Gavin, you are from Calgary, Alberta, Canada, and it's my understanding that you have been involved with the Royal Canadian Geographical Society. Could you talk a little bit about what that is?
Sure. The Royal Canadian Geographical Society, or RCGS, I would describe it as a small scale counterpart to the National Geographic Society in the US that many of your listeners would be familiar with. The Canadian Society dates back to 1929, so our 100th anniversary is coming up in 5 years. Our mission is to make Canada better known to Canadians and the world, and basically we do 3 things. We publish Canadian Geographic magazine. So again, kind of the analog would be the much more famous National Geographic magazine. Mm-hmm. And we do some other publishing that's related to the magazine. We also have an education arm. So in Canada, I'm not sure what it's like in the US, but very few schools teach geography as a standalone subject anymore. It's part of what we call social studies. So what the society does through CG education is we prepare curriculum compliant geographical teaching materials. And so the folks that sign up for it are actually teachers in elementary and what we call junior high and high school. And so we do that. And then we also, to the limited extent we provide funding for expeditions for like research grants. So one of the great things about Canada is that there's actually still lots of places to explore, particularly in the north, in the Arctic. So we have 7 what we call explorers in residence. Just as an example, there's this guy named Adam Schultz who did this amazing journey that he's written about in a book called Beyond the Trees. But basically, in 2017, to celebrate Canada's 150th anniversary, he walked from the Yukon Territory in northern Canada, roughly following the Arctic Circle. Walked/canoed, mostly canoed, all the way to Hudson's Bay.
Wow.
So 3,000 kilometers or something. So Adam is an amazing guy, and he volunteers for the society. My day job, I'm a lawyer, but I have been a volunteer for the society since 2009. I was elected a fellow of the society, and I've been a governor since 2011. I was president of the board of governors from 2016 to 2022, and I'm now sort of an ex officio member of the board because I'm immediate past president. We have some really cool people that are involved in the society. Like our former honorary president was none other than Mr. Jeopardy, Alex Trebek, who is from
Oh, wow.
Canada. Yeah, he's
Yeah.
from Ottawa. And then I don't know if you've ever heard of Wade Davis, ethnobotanist, wrote a really great book about Everest called Into the Silence.
Okay.
Anyways, he's one of our honorary VPs. We have a woman astronaut named Roberta Bondar. So a really interesting group of people, kind of to run the gamut from just geography nerds to actual teachers, geography professors, as I said, explorers, just a really interesting group of people.
That's really neat. For you, someone who's a lifelong backpacker, that seems like a really neat way to integrate your love of the outdoors with helping to, I guess, support work that relates to it throughout Canada.
Yeah, it's been an amazing fit for me. I mean, like many people in Canada, I actually had not even really heard of the Royal Canadian Geographical Society before I got involved with it, but it's been a perfect fit for me. Like, it's just, as I say, there's so many interesting people. It sort of ticks all the boxes for me in terms of my interest in the wilderness and the outdoors. And I'm a map geek, so I love maps. And so it all works for me.
Well, you've also recently become involved with something that you helped found, as I understand it, the Canadian Backcountry Trail Preservation Society. Could you talk a little bit about what that is?
A group of us. There's five. There's me and a guy named Stuart Howe, who's got a kind of a backpacking YouTube channel called How's the Hike. So Stuart and one of my law partners, Marco Baldassaro, who's I've done a lot of hiking with, and a guy named Trevor Wilson and a guy named Ken Grote. So the five of us started this Canadian Backcountry Trail Preservation Society, and basically it was because we all discovered kind of independently that a lot of the trails that we love to hike in Banff and Jasper primarily, so the two big national parks in the Canadian Rockies, are basically falling into disrepair because of lack of maintenance. And it's very frustrating to us. And so rather than just sit around a campfire or a stove, because in most cases in the national parks in Canada you can actually light a fire. But anyways, rather than just sit around and gross about it, we decided we would try to do something. So we've actually incorporated a society. We've just finished our strategic plan. We're pretty close to having our website, which is savethetrails.ca, more or less ready to go. Our mission is to secure the preservation and ongoing maintenance of backcountry trails in Canada's national parks.
What do you think's happening? Is it really just not having the financial resources as a priority for the parks, or what's the problem with maintaining the trails?
It's definitely partly money. We've done a bit of digging around and research, and we've made some access to information requests and various things. But as best we can tell, in the 90s, Canada, like the federal government, was in a huge fiscal deficit. So the government of the day came in and really sort of started cutting back all over the place. And that included Parks Canada. And in fact, Parks Canada had been a full-fledged department of it was it was under the Environment Ministry, the federal Environment Ministry. It was spun off into a sort of a government agency and expected to raise some of its own money. And so basically what's happened is funding has just been drying up. And then that's led parks to make decisions about, okay, well, we don't have a lot of money. Where are we going to allocate that money? And sadly, not everyone is as super keen on long distance backpacking as you and me. So basically, most of the money is going into the front country, or what we call the front
Got
country.
it.
So
Yeah.
So I mean that's as best we can tell, that's the problem.
Okay. Well, I wish you the best of luck with that. That's a great cause to make the deep backcountry accessible to as many people as possible. And I know that some people do worry about that. They worry if you're not someone who's comfortable with navigation and you really want to follow good trails, it can be worrisome to head out on trails that aren't maintained very well, especially if you look them up online and you find out that they have that reputation.
Yeah, I mean, we as fairly experienced backpackers, I mean, we're not expecting broad, well-constructed paths. But what's happening is bridges are getting washed out over trails on rivers and streams where unless it's a super low water year, it's just really not possible to ford the water course like on your feet. So what that means is that trails are just becoming impassable.
Right.
So you can get certain distance and then you can't go any further, which kind of destroys the whole experience.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's talk now about a trail that people can do for sure, which is the Sawback Trail. How did you end up doing this? When did you do the trail, and how did you end up deciding to go do that?
Yeah, so it's been a while now. It was 6 years ago. It was 2018. I'd been thinking about doing it for a while. It's in the kind of our local hiking Bible, the Canadian Rockies Trail Guide. And the interesting thing too is that in the winter, I'm a big skier, and there's a ski hill right outside of Banff, the town, called Mount Norquay. And basically, the trail starts at Mount Norquay, and then it goes through the backcountry and it ends at another ski hill at Lake Louise. As a skier, I always thought it would be cool to hike from Norquay to Louise. And then the final reason was the part of the park that the trail goes through is what we call the front ranges, which I'm sure you know means the sort of outermost ranges before you get to the prairie or the forest. And it's a much quieter and remoter part of the park. So to understand it, the geography of Banff, it's obviously in the Rocky Mountains. So you have these ranges that, generally speaking, go southeast to northwest. And you have these valleys that run up and down, and then passes that kind of connect the valleys. And through the main valley, north-south running valley through Banff is the Bow River Valley. So the Bow River is the river that flows through Banff, and then it flows across out of the park and actually through Calgary, where I live. So anything essentially to the east of the Bow River and north of Banff, like within the context of Banff National Park, those are the front ranges.
Okay.
And I started hiking in the front ranges, I don't know, 20 or 30 years ago. And I really kind of fell in love with the area because the main ranges, which are on the other side of the Bow River and the Trans-Canada Highway, by the way, that's where like the actual Lake Louise is. And that's where, the Continental Divide is and the glaciers and everything. So it's very spectacular scenery. I love it as much as the next person, but it gets way more people.
Right.
Because of, Lake O'Hara, Emerald Lake on the other side of the Great Divide in Yoho National Park. These are sort of iconic destinations and tons of people go there. So I sort of stumbled upon hiking in the front ranges and just kind of fell in love with it. So that was kind of the final reason why I thought it would be really good to do the Sawback Trail.
And so the Sawback Trail, as I understand it, has some optionality, meaning it's not only one route. There's some ways to do this that could be a little shorter, a little longer, or with different ways you could do it. What did you do to go about planning how you wanted to do this?
Yeah, so you're right. One of the nice things about the front ranges is you can actually connect all kinds of different trails together. Because again, you've kind of got, generally speaking, these kind of longish valleys that run, generally speaking, north-south, it's really northwest, southeast, and then they're connected by passes. And so you can hopscotch around and do all sorts of things back there. And that's why you can go for days and days at a time. So when I was looking at doing the Sawback, I thought it would be more fun I wanted to do a longer trip. So rather than kind of follow the recommended route in the guidebook, I kind of went farther into the front ranges. Plus, I had been to this one particular campsite called Flint's Park in the past and just remembered that I liked it. I mean, it had been years. So that's what we did is we basically went straight north, more or less, for 2 days to Flint's Park. And then we went over this really amazing, very high pass called Badger Pass. And then we connected with the kind of Sawback Trail proper. And we carried on north towards Lake Louise. But then once we got towards Lake Louise, we, rather than just go straight back down to the highway, we sort of did a bit of a loop around this area called Skokie, and just tacked on extra mileage because it was just a particularly beautiful area. So we were out for 7 days, but we had one kind of down day where we day hiked. We took a route that was, I guess you would say, probably 4 to 6 days, and we tacked on extra mileage and we did it in 6 days. And then we had one day doing a day hike.
So it sounds like to plan it, then you could pretty much follow the regular Sawback, but then do the one side trip to the camp that you wanted to go to, and then tack on the loop at the end.
Yeah, exactly. And you could, I mean, there are other sort of iterations of the trail you could do if you wanted to. And like I said, that's just another reason why I like the area so much, is because there are options.
So I assume this has got to be a summer into maybe early fall type of hike. This is the Rockies. It's going to be cold and snowy the rest of the year.
Oh, for sure. The backpacking season in the Rockies is basically, although I have to say, with climate change, it seems to be changing a bit. But generally speaking, it's kind of like mid-July to mid-September.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is there predictable rain, or is it dry during this time? What's it like in the Canadian Rockies during this time of year?
Well, it certainly can rain. You get a lot of thunderstorms in the Rockies. So generally, I wouldn't say, like, it's not like the West Coast where, you can get that terrible kind of constant rainfall. What often happens is it'll rain during the night, which is kind of interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So we over the years, I've spent many a night in a tent in the backcountry in a raging thunderstorm, just crazy. And then you wake up in the morning and, it's passed through and it's blue sky. And so, yeah, I mean, when it rains at night, it's perfect. I actually love being in a tent at night when it rains. So you, of course, have to bring rain gear just in case. So that, for me, that's typically like a Gore-Tex jacket and rain pants. And if it's later in the season, I'll probably bring gloves and a little toque for wearing at camp at night, because it can cool off in the evening quite a bit. But, July and August are generally pretty warm.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that occurred to me is that in the Canadian Rockies, you might have grizzly bears, which we have some of in the northern parts of the U.S., but not really anywhere else in the U.S. We have them in the northern Rockies. But how does that impact thinking about food storage, and how does that work at the various campsites to keep yourself safe from, bear encounters, essentially?
The Sawback Trail is not so remote that you random camp. So that's what Parks Canada calls it. There are some parts of the Front Ranges where you just random camp and then you're on your own. But on the Sawback Trail, we were always at a Parks Canada campsite. So they lay out the campsite so that the tent sites are some distance away from the food preparation area and the food storage area. And when we did the Sawback Trail in 2018, it was mostly those kind of old-fashioned bear poles, with the cables, and you
Mm-hmm.
tie your food bag and then you winch it up to the top. Now, most of the campsites have boxes in them, so you never cook in your tent or near your tent, and which, sometimes if the weather's bad, that can be a bit of a challenge. And then, in terms of walking, I always carry bear spray,
Mm-hmm.
and I have encountered grizzlies a couple of times. It's quite an experience. It's never been a problem, but it definitely takes your breath away when you see these things. You're also taught to, if you're walking through like willows, high bush, and that kind of thing, to make noise. Like in the old days, people would wear those annoying bear bells, which we don't do anymore.
Yeah.
We just, if it looks like I can't see very far ahead of me and the wind doesn't seem to be blowing my scent ahead of me, then I'll make noise. And generally speaking, you don't see that many bears. In my experience, grizzlies really aren't interested in running into humans.
Right.
Thank goodness. Although when you see them, like I said, it is incredibly impressive.
Yes, I've seen them once in Yellowstone National Park.
Right.
And when I saw the grizzly, I thought immediately that is not a black bear. Like, it was so obvious that it was a different animal.
Oh, yeah. The one time I really got up close and personal with the bear was we were in Jasper on a great long distance trail called the South Boundary, and I was with my daughter and another fellow old hiking buddy of mine, and so there were the three of us. I was in the lead. It was one of those things where it's kind of mid to later afternoon, and you're kind of in a bit of a zone. You're tired because you've been walking all day. The stretch of trail we were on was fairly straight, but I kind of went over a little rise, and then I looked up, and there was this big grizzly walking right towards us on the trail. They say you're not supposed to run. I kind of walked backwards very, very fast and kept looking over my shoulder. And so the three of us got off the trail. I took the safety off the bear spray. We ditched our packs and we just kind of stood in a little group, made a ton of noise, and we never saw him again.
Okay, there you go.
But yeah, it was pretty exciting.
So for a trail like this, what's the best way to think about navigation? Is this old-fashioned maps? Is there a good app that has the trail that makes it easy to follow? What did you do? And is there pretty good signage or ability to follow the trails that make this trail?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I'm pretty old-fashioned. I mean, most people these days are using apps. As I said, this was in 2018. I actually had one of those old Garmin units, but I carried the guidebook. I had a map. Really, between a very easily accessible app like All Trails or something like that and a map, you're fine. We did blow past a couple of junctions that were, I would say, poorly signed. And I don't know, I mean, at the time we were quite outraged when we discovered that we'd walked past and we were blaming Parks Canada. But, in retrospect, we may just have not really been paying close enough attention. In general, the trail conditions on the Sawback Trail are pretty good. There was one time when the trail got washed out, basically in a particularly kind of wet area around a spring. And you know how it goes. 1 minute you're on the trail, you come to sort of a confused area, whether it's like a rock fall or or you're going through a bunch of bushes, and you get to the other side and you're like, what happened to the trail?
Yeah.
So it was like one of those things, but I mean, we found it within a few minutes. It was not a big deal. Overall, this is a pretty well trod, reasonably well signed area.
Okay. And it sounds like you did it south to north. Is that the way you would recommend people do it?
I think so. I mean, that's the way it's written up in the book, for one thing. But it's one of those things where I would say the scenery gets better as you go towards Lake Louise. Like when you start at Mount Norquay, which is just outside of Banff town site, you're in the valley bottom, you're in trees, and it takes a while for you to get out of them. So it's one of those things. It's nicer to walk toward the reward. You know how it goes.
Sure.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that there are campsites that are established by the Park Service. Do you need to reserve those in advance or do people just show up? How does that work?
No, you have to reserve. If you were driving in from Calgary into Banff, the first thing is you need a park permit. So that's for the entire park. So if you were to park your car in Banff town or at a trailhead somewhere, you need a pass. Now, because we're in Calgary and we're so close to Banff and we go there all the time, I always get an annual pass, and I think it's about $140 or something Canadian for the entire year. And that's actually good at any national park in Canada. But if you were to come like for a weekend, you would stop at the gate and they would give you a pass for 2 days. I think it's 20 or $25 a day or something like that. But then if you're hiking and you want to reserve a back, and you do need to reserve, you have to reserve, and it's an online system. And, there's been a lot of griping about how well it works and doesn't work. But overall, once you've done it a couple of times, it's reasonably user friendly. So yeah, you have to sort of pick your dates and go online and figure out, is the campsite available? And then, so part of the planning is, you have to essentially plot out what campsite you think or hope you want to get to each night. And then you got to figure out, are they available? And then you book them online.
Okay. So this changes the way you think about day to day if you're not used to doing it this way, because you need to definitely decide where you're going to be stopping And so I guess I would err on the side of not going quite as far as I think I can go in case the day is more difficult or the weather's bad or something like that, because you don't want to get caught short. It'd be much better to get to a campsite, I guess, and have a little bit of extra time than to have to hike into the dark or something like that. So is that what you would recommend as far as planning?
Yeah, I mean, we usually do about 15 to 20 kilometers a day. Not
Mm,
huge. And so usually there aren't that many options. Like there might be
okay.
like often if that's what you want to do in that kind of a distance in a day, there's really only one place you can get to.
Okay.
Sometimes there's two. Then that's typically closer to the front country because people will go in to the closer campsite for the night and then they'll come
Sure.
back out the next day. But as you go farther into the backcountry, typically that you don't really have too much choice.
Okay. So
Yeah,
not as hard to plan if you just know that that's the only site out there.
yeah, that's right.
Okay. And this route is about 74 kilometers, I think, from the traditional, which is about 46 miles. But you guys did, I think, 115 kilometers.
Yeah, that's right. So we, as I said, after day two, we took a day break essentially. One member of our party wasn't feeling 100%, so we thought it would be a good idea. And like I knew that in advance, so I booked this particular campsite for 2 nights. Plus, it was a campsite that I just thought was going to be really beautiful, and it is. So we spent 2 nights there, and of the three of us, two of us went off and did a really great hike just for the day up to a pass called North Fork Pass.
Hmm.
And then we just came back and spent another night in camp and then carried on.
Would you recommend that if people had the time, is that worth a detour worth doing?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. North Fork
Okay.
Pass it really gets you into the heart of the Front Ranges in Banff where you just don't see anybody. It's really beautiful country and very wild and remote. So, yeah, I highly recommend going. And the trail carries on over the pass, but I haven't done it, but I'm told the trail on the other side of North Fork Pass is just horrendous. Like it's in terrible shape. So, if you want to see North Fork Pass, the way to do it is as a day trip from this particular campsite, which is called Flint's Park.
Okay.
Yeah.
What about the loop you did at the end? Is that something you would also, in retrospect, you think that's something worth tacking on for most people?
Yeah, I think so. It's not hard. It's you just need an extra day to do it. That's all. So basically, Lake Louise, the end point of the hike, if you go into the main ranges, as I said earlier, that's where the lake is, and there's a famous hotel there, the Chateau Lake Louise, and there's all kinds of great hikes up on the Great Divide. But on the other side of the highway, on the east or the Front Ranges side, there's this great backcountry area called Skokie. There's an old lodge that was built in the 1930s. It's a beautiful old lodge. And basically, what we did is rather than going straight out to Lake Louise, to the ski area, we walked around Skokie Mountain. And then there's a campsite called Merlin Meadows, which is just about a kilometer down the hill from the lodge. And it's a beautiful area. It's a lot of open meadows, big views. And as I said, really not particularly difficult in terms of elevation gain or anything like that. And so it's really more if you have the time, I would definitely recommend doing it.
So, for people who haven't been to this part of the Canadian Rockies, how would you describe what this all looks like? I think I mentioned to you before we came on that I've been to Waterton Lakes in the southern part of Canada, up against the border with the U.S., but I've never been to this part of the Rockies. And of course, I think we've all seen the pictures of Lake Louise with the beautiful hotel
Mhm.
and that. But in general, what does this area look like? What does it feel like to be in it?
Well, I mean, I'm probably a homer, but I would say it's absolutely gorgeous. It's a beautiful area. Like I said earlier, you have these long valleys running kind of generally north south, and so you will spend time at the beginning of the hike when you're lower down in the valley in the trees, which is peaceful but not scenically rewarding. But then you inevitably kind of get out into these long, kind of low saddle type passes where you're in meadows. It's not really alpine, it's subalpine, but you're in these meadows. They seem to go on for mile after mile. And like I said, on the east side of the highway, the east side of the Bow River, the Front Ranges, they call it the Sawback Trail because it's named for the Sawback Range of mountains. So, you can imagine Sawteeth. It's limestone, this very kind of rugged, jagged limestone peaks, a bit like the Dolomites in Italy, if you've ever been there. So yeah, you get a lot of beautiful meadows, these really quite jagged mountains, as I said. And then when you do a pass to get over the range to the next valley over, you go up and up and up these switchbacks, and you end up like in these very kind of exposed, scree, talus passes where the views are just spectacular. And there's lakes and rivers. It's I think, compared to perhaps Colorado or places in the southern Rockies, it's a bit wetter,
Hmm.
so more water and a lot of beautiful creeks and streams and small lakes. And yeah, it's a beautiful area.
How tough is the hiking? How much up and down are we talking about? I mean, I know we're in the mountains, but is this a pretty difficult 15 to 20 kilometers a day, or is this pretty doable for most people?
I would say it's doable for most experienced backpackers. If you've never hiked before, it's going to be tough. I think our biggest day elevation gain, well, I know it was going over Badger Pass, and I think it was 700 to 750 meters. So a good grunt, but not outrageous. And other days were more like 400 to 500 meters.
Okay.
So not bad, not bad.
Yeah, that sounds challenging, but not horrible.
Yeah, not horrible. Exactly.
Which is what you want. You want it to be challenging, but not ridiculous.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And so you did this in 7 days with the side trip and the add-on loop at the end.
Right.
That seems to make sense with what I've seen online about the traditional route being sort of 4 to 6 days. So it sounds like, if you're doing 5 on the regular route and adding those 2, that would be a pretty typical pace that most people could probably do.
Yeah, that's right. So yeah, as I said, if we had not done the extra walking around Skokie and not done the 2 nights at Flint's Park, it would have basically in 5 days and yeah, 75K, so 15 a day. So again, not hugely long. The one thing I would say about hiking in the Canadian Rockies, and I'm sure it's not hugely different from the US, is that leaving aside elevation gain and loss, it can be quite hard. The trails can be very rooty, like big roots, and you're kind of so there is a certain amount of you have to keep your head down
Mm-hmm.
looking, or then you're crossing scree slopes or talus, and it's you got to be paying attention. So it can be hard on the feet, but overall, I mean, if you're reasonably fit and you've done a reasonable amount of hiking, there's nothing particularly challenging about the hike.
Okay. How busy is this area in the summer? I'm guessing it's probably mostly busy at the very beginning and at the very end, and probably not so much in between the two locations. But how does that work?
Yeah, well, like I said, one of the things that I like about the Front Ranges is that they're not all that busy. I was thinking about this. I believe on our first day, and so of course we're closest to Mount Orquay. I think we saw like one other couple on the trail coming the other way, and then we got to camp. There were these two very delightful young women from Japan who had like all the greatest gear, but
All
they
Mont Bell?
yeah, but because of the language, we didn't really chat with them. But that was it. So two people in camp, two people we saw on the trail, and then on day two, we ran into a party of 4 women at Rainbow Lake, which was at 40 Mile Summit. And then we ran into a solo hiker right near our campsite. And that was it. And then we got to our campsite and there was nobody else there. And no one came the second night either. And the day that Marco and I did the trip up to North Fork Pass, nobody.
Wow.
The next day, I think we saw one group up on Badger Pass, and then there was 1 or 2 people in our campsite. So it was not crowded at all. I'm one of these sort of curmudgeonly backpackers who, when I go to the wilderness, I don't want to run into a bunch of people. I mean, I certainly don't mind, chatting with folks, but I get grumpy if I run into too many hikers.
I know the feeling. You mentioned a couple of the campsites. Maybe we could just run through pretty quickly the
Sure.
campsites that you used, and if you recommend something different than what you did, you could note that as well.
Sure. So as I said, we started at Mount Norquay. So the trail starts by going up the valley of 40 Mile Creek. So
Hmm.
we got to, I think it was about 19 kilometers, and there's a junction with a trail called Mystic Pass, and there's a campsite there. So it's got the poetic name Mystic Junction Campsite. So that's where we stayed. That's where we stayed. Now the only other option is you could carry on up towards Mystic Pass, but you'd have to go an extra 2 or 3 K, and there's another campsite up there. Other than that, you'd have to go too far. You couldn't do it in one day.
Okay.
So that was day one. Day two, we carried on over 40 Mile Summit, and we did a little detour to, I mentioned it, Rainbow Lake, which is just a gorgeous lake. And then we carried on down Sawback Creek to a campsite called Flint's Park. I've mentioned it a couple of times already. And I have to say, Flint's Park is one of my favorite campsites I've ever been at. It's at the sort of the confluence of these four valleys, north, south, east, west, and it's mostly open meadow. And the views every which way are spectacular. There's a warden cabin there that's been there since the 30s or something like that. And as I said, we had the whole campsite to ourselves. It was just phenomenal. So that's where we spent nights 2 and 3. Then we went over Badger Pass. Now there is a campsite on the Badger Pass Trail called Block Lake Junction. A lot of junction campsites. And it's nice, but it just didn't really fit with our plan.
Hmm.
And then we went over Badger Pass, and then we stayed at Badger Pass Junction campsite. And it actually was also a very pretty campsite. It was down in the Johnson Creek Valley, and again, kind of this nice open meadow, beautiful views. And then, so that was our fourth night. Our next day was fairly short. We went over a pass called Pulsatilla Pass, and we stayed at a campsite called Wildflower, which I expected would be in meadows, wildflower, but
Sure.
actually it's named for a creek, Wildflower Creek, and the campsite itself was in old growth forest, which we don't
Oh, wow.
like. The trees on the east slope of the Rockies in Alberta. I'm assuming it's similar in Colorado. Aren't that big typically, right? Because all the rain falls on the west side of the Great Divide. But there was this little patch of big old, I don't know what they were, Douglas fir, spruce. Anyways, it was an unexpectedly beautiful campsite in the forest. That was the next campsite. And then we did the loop around Skokie and ended up at a campsite called Merlin Meadows. Merlin Meadows is a much bigger, much busier campsite. That's really where we ran into people for the first time. It's a perfectly nice campsite too. It's just, doesn't have the same seclusion and whatnot as the other campsites. But one nice thing that we did is Merlin Meadows is well, as I said, it's about 1 kilometer from this historic lodge, Skokie Lodge. And at the lodge, even if you're not staying there, you can go for afternoon tea,
Oh, nice.
and if you prefer, you can get a beer, which is what we did. So we had tea, we had, food. We were on this nice little kind of afternoon repast at the lodge, and then we scooted back to our tents. And then Merlin Meadows was our last night. And then we hiked out.
If you did this trail again or advising others to do it, anything you would do differently or tell people to do differently? Or do you think you guys kind of did it the way that made the most sense?
I actually really liked the route. The only thing I would do differently is that last night, there is another campsite not too far from Merlin Meadows called Red Deer Lakes. Red Deer Lakes is basically the headwaters of the Red Deer River, which flows out of the mountains and across the prairies in Alberta. It is a much prettier campsite. I've done it on a different hike.
Hmm.
So if you were going to do that kind of extra day so you could spend more time in the Skokie area, I think I would camp at Red Deer Lakes or potentially at a campsite called Baker Lake, which again is another quieter and in my view prettier campsite than Merlin Meadows.
Okay.
Other than that, I wouldn't change a thing.
So if somebody's going to the Canadian Rockies for the first time and they're going to do a 1 week trip, why do this one versus other options that are out there? Why is this a trail worth doing?
Well, because it's pretty accessible for one thing. It starts basically on the Trans-Canada Highway at Mount Norquay and it ends at the Trans-Canada Highway at Lake Louise. So it's easily accessed. It gets you into the backcountry without getting too far. So if you haven't been in the Canadian Rockies, some of the other more remote trails in the Front Ranges might be a bit, you run into more issues with route finding,
Hmm.
trails getting lost in willows, that kind of thing. So this is generally speaking a well-marked, well-trod trail. So I think it would be a good choice for that reason as well. And it's just a beautiful trail. Like it's got it all in my view.
I know it's been several years, but as you look back on this, is there a particular moment or memory that stands out for you?
There is. I've mentioned it several times, but Flint's Park it's a favorite place of mine. And I had been there once many years ago. So that's why I wanted to go back. But I didn't really have a very specific or concrete memory of why I liked it. I just remembered, I remember liking that place. So it was our second day. We had lunch at Rainbow Lake, beautiful place. And I should say the first day, you'd asked about weather, and we were lucky. We basically got very little, if any, rain on this trip. But what we had on day one was smoke.
Ah,
So this is becoming a real problem in hiking in the summer in the Rockies is wildfire smoke. The first day when we were walking up the 40-mile valley, you couldn't see the peaks that were just right on the other side of the valley. It was that smoky. I mean, who likes to hike in wildfire smoke? It's just not a good experience. But so day two, the smoke cleared up. We had this lovely lunch at Rainbow Lake, and then we were walking down towards Flint's Park. Beautiful views, and it was just by that point it was blue sky. It was just gorgeous, and got to the bridge over the Cascade River, and it was just like one of those sort of moments when you felt like you could hear the angels singing. It was just wonderful. Yeah,
awesome. That sounds great. Gavin, thank you for telling me about your hike on the Sawback Trail. But while I've got you, I've got a few more questions, if you
sure.
don't mind.
Yeah.
So, what is one piece of gear you don't leave home without?
I always bring a compass and a map. And
Do you ever use the compass?
I actually do use the compass. Yeah, I do.
Okay.
Not that often, and it's more for my pleasure. Like I've rarely had to use it to actually figure out where the heck I am.
Uh,
After we've had dinner at the campsite, I love to pull out my map and then lay my compass down on the map and sort of triangulate and figure out where I am and what mountain is which and everything. And sometimes it's not all that obvious. And so it's more kind of just a fun thing that I like to do. It's less, I mean, it's not like a critical piece of gear that I've had to rely on to not get lost. I mean, maybe a couple of times I've used it that way, but mainly I just really love to do it. So,
I also bring a compass, and I also always bring a paper map. And there was a time when I did some training and some route finding skill training and really learned how to use a compass. But it's been so long that when I do it now, I forget how to use it.
I feel like I relearn it every time I go out on a hike, to be honest.
And I used to do what you described, which is pull it out in camp and use it to identify things and kind of triangulate and see where I am.
Yeah.
Hearing you say that reminds me I should do that more often because it's a skill you should keep up. Ultimately the electronics could die on you at some point, and it's helpful to know how to use a compass.
Yeah.
And it's actually fun. So
It is fun.
I
Yeah.
like that. Yeah. All right. What's one hiking trip you've done besides this one that others shouldn't miss out on?
Okay, so if you're going to come to the Canadian Rockies and you do not do the Sawback Trail, I would strongly urge you to hike into Mount Assiniboine. I don't know if you've ever heard of Mount Assiniboine.
No.
It's our Matterhorn. It's got that kind of almost perfect Toblerone-like shape, and it's right up on the Great Divide in an area of just full of meadows. So it's just wide open. The best way to walk there, it's about 30 to 33 kilometers. But there's a ski resort called Sunshine Meadows. So from Sunshine, you can walk basically just following the Great Divide, and you get right to Mount Assiniboine. There's a lake at the base of the mountain called Lake Magog. It is just absolutely stunning. Like, it's so beautiful. It's ridiculous. It's a phenomenal hike. It's part of the Great Divide Trail, actually.
Okay.
Yeah.
What's the next trip on your list?
Well, I have a bucket list. Whether it actually turns out to be my next hike or not, you know how that goes. But
Yeah.
there's an area in northwestern British Columbia called Mount Edziza. I think it's Edziza, and it's this really weird kind of volcanic area. So it's like one of the only volcanic ranges in northern Canada. If you Google it and look at the images, you'll see why. It's a pretty spectacular area, and you have to fly in to the trailhead. A lot of people will get a guide to take them. I don't actually think we would probably need a guide, but it's not hugely far. I think it's maybe 70K. It's more a route than a trail.
Mm-hmm.
So most people give themselves, I think, close to a week to do it. And the scenery just looks amazing. The other hike I would love to do before I get too old and decrepit is, I think it's called a Yakshak Pass, and it's on Baffin Island in Nunavut territory in Canada.
Wow.
Yeah, I don't know if you've ever seen those photos of a mountain called Thor, like the Norse god Thor. And then there's one Asgard. Anyways, unlike the Rockies, which are primarily limestone, these mountains are granite. So it's kind of like,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, like Half Dome or something, but way up in the Arctic. And there's an ice field. And anyways, I think it's about 100-kilometer trail, and it goes from one side of a peninsula, so the ocean,
Uh-huh.
to the other side. There's no trees. It's all kind of tundra. There's rushing, raging glacial melt streams and these huge granite mountains, and it looks amazing.
Which one of these is coming up this next summer?
I think Edziza is, to be honest, because
Okay.
there's a lot of logistics involved with doing a Yakshak.
Yeah, that sounds like it. What is the best campsite or backcountry spot you've ever been to? And I think we've talked about Flint's Park quite a bit. Is there another one that you have?
Yeah. So besides Flint's, the other place is it's called Castleguard Meadows. The trail to Castleguard Meadows is one of the trails that is now no longer maintained by Parks Canada. So to get there is a real trek. In fact, there's two ways you can get to it. One is an old trail that's, as I've said, it's in horrible shape now, and it's really getting close to impossible. But we did it the year before we did the Sawback Trail. The trail was in such poor condition that we went out the other way, which actually entails walking down a glacier, the Saskatchewan Glacier, which I have to say was a super cool experience.
Was that safe?
Yeah, it was August. There was no, like, you didn't have the issue of snow covering crevasses or anything like that. You could see it all.
Right.
I
Okay.
mean, it was a bit unnerving. I have to say, we did not. This was not our intended route, so we didn't have crampons or anything. Like no ice axes, nothing. And so I had a bit of trouble persuading my companions that this was the best way out. But honestly, it had been such a struggle to get there that it seemed like a better thing to do. But the campsite itself is it's a decommissioned campsite, although it was great. We got there and there was actually still a functioning outhouse.
Wow.
In the middle of nowhere. And this place, Castleguard Meadows, is right on the edge of the Columbia ice field, which is, they call it the triple apex or something, because it's this enormous ice field, and it's the headwaters of the Athabasca River, which flows into Lake Athabasca, which flows into the Mackenzie River, which then flows into the Beaufort Sea, so it goes to the Arctic Ocean. It's the headwaters of the Saskatchewan River, which flows east to Hudson's Bay, so kind of the Atlantic, I guess. And then also one of the big rivers that goes to the Pacific. So basically, It's the crown of the continent, some people call it. Arctic, Ocean, Atlantic, Pacific, pretty cool area.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. That sounds like a tough one to get to, but if
It
people can
is.
do it, it sounds like it's worth it though.
It is. If you can do it, one way to do it might be, if you were prepared to pay, is to have a guide take you up the
Yeah,
glacier just to be safe.
right.
Because once you're up there, you don't want to leave. Like, it is so amazing.
Okay.
And it would be nice to have someone that could take you right up onto the ice field, and some of the peaks around there would be easily scrambled and that kind of thing.
Okay. That sounds
Yeah.
really cool. Last question. What is the most valuable thing backpacking has taught you?
Well, I love multiple day trips. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to do a really long one. A week is as far as long as I've ever done it. But I like those trips because they teach you, I think, that you are not indispensable. Did I say that right? Yeah, you are
So
not
you are just
indispensable.
you are
You are
dispensable.
dispensable, right? Like, you leave your office behind, and nothing changes. You're off in the wilderness. You have this incredible experience. You're off grid. I don't really use satellite devices very much. And then you come back, and everything is as it was. It's like the office will carry on, the files will carry on. So to me, it helps put things in perspective. You can get off grid. You can leave social media, leave the phone, leave all that stuff, and it's just good for you. It's good for your mental health. The other thing I like about longer trips, backpacking trips, is you have to be resourceful. So it's kind of fun. You can't be asleep at the switch, because if you are, you could, like, tumble down a mountain slope, or you could fall into a fairly tricky creek crossing or river crossing. So there's also the challenge that I really like. So I think it teaches you, that you can do it, right? You can do these things.
Right.
You get a real kind of sense of accomplishment.
I really love your point about being not indispensable, because I think it's a point that a lot of people need to hear, because a lot of people will not do these kinds of trips because they're worried about being out of touch from their employer for a week, or their, business that they own, or whatever it is. And it's important for them to understand that they can just, like you said, the world will go on, people will figure it out. And when they get back, they'll pick up right where they left off. If you don't go do these things now, when are you going to do them? So
Totally. And honestly, half the time, you'll run into a colleague in the hall, and they're like, "Oh, you were away?"
yeah,
So,
exactly.
so you're like, "Yeah, I was away."
All
Anyway,
right.
so yeah, I think getting out into the backcountry for any reasonable length of time is just, it's good for the soul. It's good for giving you perspective on who you are, your place in the world.
Well, Gavin, I think that's a great place to leave it. Thanks for coming on the show. I appreciate it.
Oh, you're very welcome. It was a pleasure.
Thanks again to Gavin Fitch for coming on the show, and I hope that we've inspired you to hike the Sawback Trail. And if you've enjoyed this episode, tell a friend about it, or better yet, give us a good review on whichever podcast service you use. And keep in mind that this podcast is entertainment and meant to spark your interest. If you decide to hike the trail, do your own research. Like anything else worth doing, outdoor adventure has risk. So when you go, pack your common sense. And when you get back, tell me how it went. All right. Next time on Trails Worth Hiking, we go even further north, but not in North America. We hop across the pond to go to Northern Europe, like way north, all the way to the Arctic Circle for part of this hike, to one of the largest remaining wildernesses in Europe, where we'll hike more than 450 kilometers, or almost 300 miles, where we'll camp or stay in huts as we cross the Arctic tundra on the Kungsleden, or the King's Trail in Lapland in northern Sweden. If you have any questions or feedback on this episode, or ideas for future episodes, including if you want to be a guest and talk about a trail that you've hiked, reach out to me at trailsworthhiking@gmail.com. And please follow us on Instagram at Trails Worth Hiking Podcast to see photos of all these hikes, and to possibly win an outdoor herbivore gift certificate in our next Instagram contest. So start planning your next hike, and before you know it, you'll be on the trail. Thanks for listening.